Bibles back to Job chapter 40. Job chapter 40. Doesn't sound like it's on. Hear me now. Be a little closer to you. All right, Job chapter 40. We're really beginning God's second sermon to Job. In many ways, we concluded this morning the first sermon, and so now we'll be looking at the second one. And I just want to read it again, just because I really feel like that communicates so much of what Job is experiencing. And just the intensity of it, in a sense. So, Job chapter 40, you'll be able to follow along if you like, or if you want to just close your eyes and listen, that's up to you. Job chapter 40, verse 6. Then answered the Lord unto Job out of the whirlwind and said, Gird up thy loins like a man. I will demand of thee, declare thou unto me. Wilt thou also disannul my judgment? Wilt thou condemn me that thou mayest be righteous? Hast thou an arm like God? Or canst thou thunder with a voice like him? Deck thyself now with majesty and excellency, and array thyself with glory and beauty. Cast abroad the rage of thy wrath, and behold everyone that is proud and abase him. Look on everyone that is proud, and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place. Hide them in the dust together, and bind their faces in secret. Then I will also confess thee, that thine own right hand can save thee. Behold now, Behemoth, which I made with thee, he eateth the grass as an ox. Lo, now his strength is in his loins, as a force in his navel of his belly. He moveth his tail like a cedar, with the sinews of his stones are wrapped together. His bones are strong as pieces of brass. His bones are like the bars of iron. He is the chief of the ways of God. He that made him can make his sword to approach unto him. Surely the mountains bring him forth food, where all the beasts of his field play. He lieth under the shade trees in the covert of the reed in the fens. The shady trees cover him with their shadow. The willows of the brook compass about him. Behold, he drinketh up a river, and hasteth not. He trusteth that he can draw up Jordan into his mouth. He taketh it with his eyes, and his nose pierces through the snares. Chapter 41. Canst thou draw Leviathan with a hook, or his tongue with a cord, which thou lettest down? Canst thou put a hook into his nose, or bore his jaw through with a thorn? Will he make any supplication unto thee? Will he speak soft words unto thee? Will he make a covenant with thee? Wilt thou take him for servant forever? Wilt thou play with him as with a bird? Or wilt thou bind him with thy maidens? Shall the companions make a banquet of him? Shall they part him among the merchants? Canst thou fill his skin with barbed irons, or his head with fish spears? Lay thine hand upon him. Remember the battle, do no more. Behold, the hope of him is in vain. Shall not one be cast down even into the sight of him? None is so fierce that dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand before me? Who hath prevented me that I should repay him? Whatsoever is under the whole heaven is mine. I will not conceal his parts, nor honor his power, nor his comely portion. Who can discover the face of his garment, or who can come to him with his double bridle? Who can open the doors about his face? His teeth are terrible round about. His scales are his pride, shut up together with a close seal. One so near another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together that they cannot be sundered. By his neesings a light doth shine, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of the mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils goeth smoke, as out of a seething pot or cauldron. His breath kindleth coals, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. In his neck remaineth strength, and sorrow is turned into joy before him. The flanks of his flesh are joined together, they are firm in themselves, they cannot be moved. His heart is as firm as stone, yea, as hard as a piece of the nether millstone. When he raised up himself, the mighty are afraid. By reason of breaking, they purify themselves. The sword of him that layeth at him cannot hold, the spear, nor the dart, nor the habergeon. He esteemeth iron as straw, and brass as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. Sling stones are turned with him into stubble. Darts are counted as stubble. He laughs at the shaking of the spear. Sharp stones are under him. He spreadeth sharp-pointed things upon the mire. He maketh the deep to boil like a pot. He maketh the sea like a pot of ointment. He maketh a path to shine after him. One would think the deep to be hoary. Upon the earth there is not his like, who is made without fear. Beholdeth all things, he is a king over the children of pride. So we have these two descriptions here, one of the behemoth and one of Leviathan. We won't get through all of this today. But I hope you can kind of get a sense of what Job was experiencing as God was talking to him out of a tornado. Okay? If you remember from this morning, God is still speaking from the whirlwind. In fact, in verse 6, that's exactly what we see, isn't it? Then answered the Lord unto Job out of the whirlwind and said. So this is a really intense time for Job. He hasn't he hasn't said much. In fact, when he did speak, what did he say? I'm going to stop talking. That's the only thing Job has really said in this whole experience. Starting with Elihu up until now, the only thing he's really talked about is how he's talked too much. And so he really, in many ways, is still silent. And so God continues, after giving Job that opportunity to make his case. You remember Job begged and begged and begged, God, give me my day in court. And God said, okay, here's your day in court. And what does Job do? He puts his hand over his mouth and he says, I got to stop talking. I've gotten myself in way too much trouble. And so God, only allowing the silence to go on so long, continues. In verse 6, it continues out of the whirlwind. Now, verses 6 and 7 may sound familiar to you because it's in large part the same way he began in chapter 38 with his first sermon to Job. Gird up thy loins now like a man. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. So 2 times now, God has said to Job, man up. Man up. And I didn't really spend a whole lot of time on that last time, but I want us to think about that a little bit this evening. Why is it that twice now God has told Job to man up? Is he telling Job, you know what, you're whining way too much about all this, all this stuff that you think you lost, or, you're tired of hearing you complain about your boils, Job? I really don't think that's what God has in mind. I don't think God is telling Job to man up and just endure the pain that he's endured. I mean, let's be honest, could any of us endure what Job endured without saying a word, or without crying at all? We would cry ourselves to sleep every single night. And there's not a man in this world, no matter how manly he is, that would deny Job that. So I don't think it's God telling Job to dumb down his emotions in this moment. That's not really what manning up is anyway, is it? What is it that God is trying to get Job to do when he says, Job, I need you to man up? Well, it's one of the hardest things for anyone to do. And it's a large part about being a man because it's a huge part of leading by example. And that is admitting when we are wrong. It's hard for everybody, man or woman, right? It's hard to admit when we are wrong. However, it hits very close to home for men as we try to lead, be the spiritual leaders of our homes, and set that kind of example for our children, for our grandchildren, younger generations, to admit when we do something wrong. And all of us have failed at that point in our lives, if we're honest, right? There has been something at some point in our lives where we have failed to genuinely admit when we need correction. To admit that what we did was wrong, whether or not the other person was right or wrong, is really beside the point, isn't it? I responded incorrectly in this moment. That's what being a man in part. That's what Job needs to do in this moment. And so for the second time, God tells Job, Job, it's time to man up. Gird up thy loins now like a man. It has this idea of getting ready. That's the idea of girding up the loins, to tuck the robes up into the belt so that you can move about freely. You need to gird up your loins. You need to get ready for action and act like a man. And so he begins in verses 8 and 9 with 4 questions. God's very, I don't know what you want to call it. He asks a lot of questions here, doesn't he? That's all chapters 38 and 39 were, for the most part, were questions. And there's even more questions to come. But these questions are a little bit different. They're not illustrative. They're not God asking Job about an animal or about the weather. They're more direct. Look at verse 8. Wilt thou also disannul my judgment? Wilt thou also disannul my judgment? So he's speaking directly to Job in this question. What is he asking? Job, are you going to cast aside my judgment, my counsel, my decisions? Is that what you're willing to cast aside? Because you are so, you're willing to parade your own self-righteousness to the point where you're not going to listen to me anymore. Is that what you're going to do, Job? Now, all of us have been guilty from, in one time or another, of not taking advice that we should have, right? Whether it's when we're young and we hear the counsel of our mom and dad and we think we know better, or even later in life when someone gives us good counsel and we weigh the options and decide to go another way only to regret it later. But that takes on a whole new level when it's God giving when it's God is the one giving the advice, right? We'll get that out one way or another. So God is saying, Job, I'm giving you this counsel, this advice. Are you going to cast it aside? Is that what you're going to do in this moment? And that's honestly kind of the question that we have to answer every time we open God's Word. What are you going to do with what you read there? There's sort of 3 options, isn't there? There's total rejection, which hopefully most Christians don't choose that option. There's correct application, which is what we should be shooting for. But unfortunately, where do most Christians fall? In the middle there somewhere, don't they? Where we don't really apply anything that we read, but we read it just to check off the to-do list of our devotions for that day or whatever it may be? Will we cast aside the judgment of God, the counsel of God? I believe it should be the prayer of every believer, every single day, God, what are you going to teach me today? And if you're going to learn it, guess what you have to do? You have to open His Word in a daily fashion. Will thou disannul my judgment? Are you going to cast aside my judgment? Look at this second question. Wilt thou condemn me, that thou mayest be righteous? Okay, this question gets a little sharper, doesn't it? It's a little sharper. Will you condemn me so that you can claim righteousness? That is essentially, as we have said before, what Job was doing when he was trying to proclaim his own innocence and righteousness. He got so upset, he got so angry to the point where he began to sort of shake his fist at God. And the implication being, God, I am more righteous than you. And that's where Job really went off course. We cannot artificially inflate our view of self without deflating our view of God. We cannot artificially inflate our view of self without deflating our view of God. As I said this morning, we're on a scale with God. The higher we view ourselves, what happens to God on the other side of the scale? The lower we view Him. And again, it's not about seeing ourselves more lowly than we ought to think. It's about having an accurate view of ourselves. And the way that we go about having an accurate view of ourselves is by having an accurate view of God, because we begin to see ourselves through His eyes. It's human nature for us to try to make ourselves feel better by deriding others, isn't it? Well, I'm not as bad as so-and-so. Job needed to come to terms with his imperfections. Now, Bildad and Zophar and Eliphaz, they were trying to accuse Job of some specific sin that caused all of his malady. They were wrong. We know that from day one as we read the book of Job, don't we? But just because Job wasn't guilty of some heinous crime doesn't mean he was perfect, right? And in the midst of all of this narrative about what Job was going through, God had the bigger picture of His glory at play that we read about in the first 2 chapters. In this conversation with Satan, and how he's going to prove his glory to Satan, and how he's going to prove his worthiness of worship to Satan through this person, Job. So yes, there's a big picture going on here in Job between God and Satan and the cosmos and the world and all of that. But there is an underlying thread that goes through the book of Job, and it's this: what is Job learning in all of this? What's going on the human level, right? We always keep in mind that there's this cosmic battle in play, so to speak, of God proving His glory to Satan. But there's a human element that we can't forget, that Job goes through this as a man and experiences this suffering and learns these valuable lessons. In the midst of that, he made mistakes. He sinned with his lips. He never turned his back on God. He never denied that God existed. He believed in God throughout. But he got very angry with God and denied at times God's righteousness. Even to the point of exalting himself above God, even though I don't think that was necessarily his intent. Wilt thou condemn me that thou may be righteous? Are you going to cast me down, Job, just so you can prove how righteous you are? And so that introduces us to the second challenge that God gives to Job. Remember the first challenge from this morning, where God says to Job, here's your chance to try me in court. And Job is silent. God's next challenge to Job is, he says, Job, okay, you didn't take me to court. I'm going to give you the opportunity to be the ruler of the universe. I'm going to let you be in charge, Job. And we'll see how it goes. Verse 9. Hast thou an arm like God? Or canst thou thunder with a voice like him? Deck thyself now with majesty and excellency, and array thyself with glory and beauty. Cast abroad the rage of thy wrath, and behold everyone that is proud, and abase him. Look on everyone that is proud, and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place. And he goes on in this description. And so he says here, Job, here's your opportunity. I'm going to let you be the ruler of the world, of the universe. I'm going to let you be in control. It seems like you want to be, the way you've been talking to me. So I'm going to let you do whatever you want. I'm going to let you show me how you can do it better. But there's some qualifications to this, Job, that you have to meet in order to be able to do this. The first is, hast thou an arm like God? A picture of God's strength. Since you are so convinced, Job, that you're right and I'm wrong, how about you rule the world for a little while? Do you have an arm of strength to do this even for a moment? Can you do this for just a second even? Do you have the strength to do that? Canst thou thunder with a voice like him? Job, you not only have to have my strength, you have to have my voice. The voice that spoke the world into existence. That's the voice you need, Job. Can you handle it? Can you do this for just a moment? I'm going to go take a break. Obviously, the answer to all four of these questions is a resounding no. No, God. I won't cast aside your judgment. No, God. I won't condemn you so that I can be righteous. No, God, I don't have strength like you do. No, God, I don't have a voice like you do. But God doesn't stop there. He goes on. He says, he says to Job, you have to, put on the judge's regalia. You have to put on the robe and the wig and everything. You have to adorn yourself as I am adorned with majesty and excellency. Verse 10. To array yourself with glory and with beauty. Can you do that, Job? If you're going to take my place for a moment. Christopher Ashe, who you've heard me quote from time to time, says, God in effect says, here are my royal robes, my judge's wig, and my gown of majesty and dignity. Why don't you put them on? Go on. You will look glorious and splendid with them. You will look fine and dandy. Okay, now let your anger and injustice overflow. Look at the arrogant and the wicked and bring them down. Bring them low and tread upon them. Bury them in the dust. Tie them up in the place of the dead, which is your dungeon. For as you know, I have a day against all that is proud and lofty. How are you getting on? Is it going well? Your efforts to put the world to rights, what's that? You're angry. Your speeches don't seem to have made any difference. How frustrating that must be. Keep trying a bit longer, a touch harder. I'm sure you'll manage it. It's not difficult, surely, to run the world better than I have been doing. After all, I've been making a rather mess of it. This guy's British. That's why he says things like that. I'm so glad you're here to help. We can picture, he says, this dark comic scene and hear the tones of their voices. And then at the end, God says, look, when you finally have succeeded, I will roll over and admit that you have it within your power and wisdom to save yourself. Then I will gladly abdicate and hand over the government of the universe to you, Job. What was Job's words in verse 4? Behold, I am vile. What is that? That word vile should be translated what? Small. If he felt small before, how does he feel now? Yeah. He went from feeling like an ant to an atom. I mean, I cannot imagine trying to bear the weight of God's words here. But notice what God ends with here in verse 14 in this section. Then will I also confess unto thee that thine own right hand can save thee. Job, if you can do all of these things, if you can have the strength that I possess, if you can speak with my voice, if you can adorn yourself as I am, if you can be the judge that I am, then I will admit that you can save yourself. But could Job save himself? No. And yet, there are still people today that are trying to do that very thing. If I'm just good enough, I won't go to hell. Think about who Job was before all of this. I mean, he was God. What did God call him? Righteous and upright, blameless. And yet here, what is God saying? There is no possible way you could ever save yourself. This is the standard by which you would have to live. You would have to be me, God says to Job. And you can't do it. Now, very briefly, I want to go back to verse 11. God says one of the qualifications is that you have to cast abroad the rage of thy wrath and behold everyone that is proud and abase him. The wrath of God. I don't fully understand the wrath of God. Where and when he chooses to pour it out is totally his prerogative. I know there is coming a day when it will be poured out on the world such as we have never seen. But until that time, I don't know what his requirements are for his wrath to be poured out in a local way, I guess you could say. But imagine here for a moment, Job saying, okay, I'll do that. Our wrath compared to God's must look like to God a child throwing a temper tantrum. As much as angry as we can get and try to make things right and to punish the wicked and do all of these things, from God's perspective, it must look like we've thrown ourselves on the ground and are beating our hands on the dirt and are kicking our legs and what have you. As great as a man's wrath can be, it doesn't even compare to the judgment and wrath of God. We don't have the ability to put down the proud of heart, as God will completely one day. Then we see this example of the behemoth. And what God turns again now to animals to make a point to Job. Now, whereas before he went through a long list of animals, from goats to sparrows to ostriches and all kinds of things, he really focuses in on two here. Now, I'm going to get one question out of the way from the get-go. What is the behemoth and leviathan? And the answer is?
I've heard one theory that a behemoth is actually a brontosaurus or dinosaur. That's just a theory that I heard.
There's lots of theories. There's only one right answer, and that's I don't know. Lots of theories. I've heard that theory. I've heard there's some people that think it's a hippopotamus, which doesn't make sense to me with the way the tail is described. But I don't know what they are. That's kind of beside the point. Okay? There was some animal, I believe that they were literal creatures, actually. I believe that they did walk the earth. There's a lot of people that believe that they were just illustrations that Job was familiar with in literature of his day, which I'm not going to say is impossible, but I just don't see that in the text. I don't think there's room for that. So I believe that they were literal creatures. What they are and totally what they look like, I don't know. Honestly, I don't really even care. It's in God's Word, so I'm just going to read it and try to figure out what God's trying to say. So behold now Behemoth, which I made with thee. He eateth the grass as an ox. So what does God establish from the get-go? He created it. He's already established his authority over this creature as it. But he slides in another statement, real subtle. What else is it? With Job. I made that one, but I made you too, Job. Perhaps that's the reminder Job needed in this moment. I made it with you. Now, then he goes into this section about its diet. It eats what? Grass. We're going to get a little more interactive here in the last 10 minutes. Okay? As we read this earlier, did you get the sense that this was a large animal or a small animal? Very large, right? Bigger than what we would be accustomed to being around. And yet, what does it eat? Grass. Does that seem a little bit contradictory to you? You would think that it would need a little bit more than that. I mean, we've got some farmers in here. I mean, cows are big animals, right? Horses. And yet, they spend all their time doing what? I mean, Donna and Alvin, how much do you have to feed those things? And this thing, this enormous creature, and God says, I want it to eat grass. Okay, God. I think he does those things just to confuse me, but his strength, verse 16, is in his loins, and the force is in the navel of his belly. That's a troublesome translation in the King James. And it's not the word, it's not the belly button that it's being referred to there. It's the abdominal muscles. Okay? The force, his strength is in his core. The idea here is he has a strong core in his legs and in his belly, in his core, the muscles, the abs, if you will. And so he goes from the diet to talking about his muscles and how strong this creature is. Verse 17, he talks about the tail, like a cedar tree. And the sinew of his thighs would be an accurate translation there, are knit together or wrapped together. The King James uses stones there. It really should be legs or thighs. So his strength, his muscles are being described here. Then he goes to his bones in verse 18, like strong pieces of brass or bars of iron. He talks about, in verse 19, his relationship to the other animals of the kingdom. He's the chief of the ways of God, sort of the animal kingdom is the idea there. There's only one person, God says, that can approach this animal without fear. He that made him can make his sword to approach unto him. So in other words, only the person that made the behemoth can tame the behemoth. That creature was never tamed. It's not around anymore today, is it? God says, I am the only one that can approach it in that way. Surely the mountains bring forth him food, where all the beasts of the field play. That has the idea of him subduing his territory, and the other beasts being forced out of it in their arena. He lieth under the shady trees, in the covert of the reed and the fens, or a locust tree. Shady trees cover them with their shadow. The willows of the brook compass about him. Look how much he drinks in verse 23. Behold, he drinketh up a river, and hasteth not. He trusteth that he can draw up Jordan into his mouth. He taketh it with his eyes, his nose pierceth through the snare. So my question for you this evening is, why does God spend time talking about this particular animal? What's the point? Again, is this the answer Job was looking for? God, why am I in such pain? Why did you take all of these things from me? Why, God? Why? Job, I want to tell you about the behemoth. You think that was frustrating for Job? And yet, Job knew that he was hearing exactly what he needed to hear, because what does he do? I'm not going to talk anymore. So what is it that God is trying to communicate to Job by telling him about the behemoth? And really the Leviathan of chapter 41. What do you guys think? What was that?
I'm the creator.
I'm the creator.
I control these animals. I control everything that happens in your life.
He's sovereign. He controls. People get frustrated with the book of Job. It's a hard one to read, isn't it? People feel like it gets repetitive, and they don't feel like God gives Job the answers that he deserves. But what is the one answer that Job really gets? He does get an answer. It just may not be the one we want. It may have not been the one Job wanted. God's answer to all of Job's ravings is this: I am God. Period. The end. That's it. The question that we're faced with as we read the book of Job is, when God responds to us that way, are we going to be okay with it? Are we going to be okay with God responding to us with, I'm God, trust me, the end? Maybe he doesn't tell us why we have cancer. Maybe he doesn't tell us why our loved one died. Maybe his response is, I created the world. I created you. Remember, that's how we began that whole thing with the behemoth. I'm God, trust me, the end. I'm going to give you a sneak peek. Chapter 42. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Remember, that's exactly what God said to Job. Therefore I have uttered that I have understood not. I have said things that I don't understand. Things too wonderful for me, which I knew not. Hear, I beseech thee, and I will speak. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me. I have heard thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eyes see. Wherefore I abhor myself, and repent in dust and in ashes. Some people argue about whether or not Job sinned. I believe that he did. Otherwise, why would he repent? But the lesson here is not whether or not Job sinned. It's the fact that he did what? He repented. So in the midst of all of this big picture stuff that was going on with God and with Satan, Job learned a lesson. A hard one. And he repented. And what was the lesson Job learned? God is God. He is in control. Trust him. That's sort of the story of Job. We're almost done with it. Not quite. One of the most difficult things about living the Christian life is not getting those answers that we want so bad. But we walk by faith, not by what? Sight. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word. We pray that it would continue to penetrate our hearts, to help us to walk with you closer and closer, to love you more every day. We thank you for the book of Job and the life of Job that we can learn from and apply. Help us to find opportunity this week to magnify the name of Christ, to share him with the lost and dying world around us. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen. Thank you and have a good night.